Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir, for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to sincerely thank you for the ruling which you have just made on the issue of the changes on the side of the minority. Mr. Speaker, I have been very, very uncomfortable for the last 3 weeks that we have had this altercation on the issue of this leadership. Because, Mr. Speaker, in my view, I thought that it was a very minor issue. It was an issue more of a procedure, and it would not have affected our participation as much as it did. Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that that issue brought a lot of misunderstanding, but finally we have come to a positive conclusion. And Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the ruling. Mr. Speaker, having said that, I also stand to support this motion. Mr. Speaker, this is a very, very important motion. It is something which is very popular in the developed world, but here in our country, people give it a second line. They put it at the back of the business. Mr. Speaker, it is a very, very, very important council because, Mr. Speaker, I remember when I was a young boy, my father, who was a teacher, knew the importance of planting trees. They knew the importance of trees affecting the rainfall. And Mr. Speaker, I remember me and my brother, young brother Raila, we used to stay in Bondo in the rural areas. And my father used to work in Kisumu. But he would give us an assignment to plant trees. And he would come to supervise us every weekend and see that we not only plant trees, but we protect them against destruction by the animals. We also make sure that, he also makes sure that we water them so that they start growing and make sure that they grow to maturity. And some of the trees we planted in the 50s, early 50s, Mr. Speaker, are still there. I will take some of you who are my friends like Chariot, come and see some of those big trees we planted in the early 50s. And Mr. Speaker, I live around the lake. My constituency and my county is around Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is more or less like a rain shadow, Mr. Speaker. It is a rain shadow because there is evaporation which takes place. But this evaporation goes to Kericho, it goes to Kisii, it goes to Nandi. They benefit from the lake, but we don't benefit from the lake. Mr. Speaker, because there is little rainfall around the lake. So we are more or less a semi-arid county, or we have our counties around the lake are more or less semi-arid, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, the best for us would have been to harvest water which comes from our rivers, and all our rivers. In fact, most of the rivers draining into Lake Victoria are from our region. In fact, from Kenya. Most of them are from Kenya. And Mr. Speaker, they all drain coming from Nandi, coming from Kericho, like the Miriu River, the Nyando River, the Nzoia River, coming from those hills around Cherangani, and so on. Mr. Speaker, they drain not only the water, but they also go with our topsoil, which is the most fertile, Mr. Speaker. And all of it goes down up to Egypt. And Egypt has a big dam, which is called a Swan Dam. And they use our water to do irrigation, to produce electricity, and then grow food and export back to us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very, very serious situation, and we hope that the government is taking note so that some of these rivers can be dammed, like the Kericho, this is the Koru Soin Dam. Yeah, the Koru Soin Dam. Honorable Secretariat, please, let's work together and see that that dam is actualized so that it can produce electricity and it can also control the floods downstream. Mr. Speaker, we cannot overemphasize the importance of climate change. Mr. Speaker, our country is experiencing a very serious drought which we have never had in the last 40 years. And Mr. Speaker, personally, this kind of drought I only experienced in 1952 when I was still a small kid. Mr. Speaker, this kind of drought was called Aronga in my area. And Mr. Speaker, the government of the day does not appear to realize that we are going through a very, very serious situation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this country is in ICU. And Mr. Speaker, the government of the day is behaving as if it is a normal situation. They are still using the IMF prescriptions, which they know brought a lot of trouble for very many governments in the 80s and in the 90s. Mr. Speaker, there are governments which collapsed just because of ignoring taking the IMF prescriptions, which our government is taking. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing wrong with the economic theories of the IMF and the prescriptions they are giving of austerity. But Mr. Speaker, those austerities belong to normal times. But it appears, Mr. Speaker, that our government is giving treatment which is for malaria, and they don't realize that their patient is actually in ICU. Mr. Speaker, the prescriptions which should be given should be for ICU and not for normal malaria, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I cannot overemphasize the importance of climate change, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that they were used to, during colonial times, we used to have a law or a treaty which was signed during colonial times in 1927. It was abrogated, I think, by Martha Karua when she was Minister of Water. And Mr. Speaker, that means that we can now use our waters, we can now do irrigation, but we also have to continue planting trees, Mr. Speaker, so that we can try to mitigate what is happening in Europe. Mr. Speaker, it is Europe and America which is polluting the air. And that pollution which they are creating in the air is actually the one creating serious and adverse climate change, which is affecting us, even though we don't produce as much of that gas as much as they do. But Mr. Speaker, much as we are affected, they are also ready to compensate us through what they call the carbon trade. But Mr. Speaker, other countries are taking advantage of the carbon trade. But I have not seen Kenyans or even the government itself taking this trade in carbon seriously, so that we can also benefit from some of the provisions which some of those very big companies emitting so much and polluting the air heavily pay to mitigate the tree planting and other measures which we take in our developing countries. Mr. Speaker, I would want to finish by supporting the appointment of these three Kenyans who are highly qualified, Mr. Speaker, because, Mr. Speaker, when I saw the name of Professor Odero Uta, somebody I know very well who is not only qualified but is so committed to this matter of climate change. Mr. Speaker, I try to mirror all the rest of the appointees through DERA because I know then there is seriousness in dealing with this issue of climate change by making this appointment. Mr. Speaker, I conclude by supporting this motion, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.
Senator Wamatenga.
Thank you very